I don't think I need to tell you all this about the problems of interdisciplinary researchers and interdisciplinary research and the challenge thereof. And some people in interdisciplinary studies liken this to the problem of Aristotle's legacy, where when they started to ponder the world and nature and matter, they started to separate these different questions into different areas and different disciplines. So when the modern university was created, it started to fractionalize our pursuit of understanding of the world around us. And the American Psychological Association's policy person wrote about this problem of interdisciplinary research, and I quote this all of the time because I think it most succinctly captures this problem we face in interdisciplinary science. The quote is, "The way in which universities has divided up its departments is not the way nature has divided up its problems." So this center is a perfect example of that. You're trying to address a particular problem that cuts across disciplines. And what's been going on is that there are many scientists such as yourself who are trying to address these complex societal problems by bringing together people from different disciplines to try to solve them. So what I want to talk about in the first part is, well, who exactly has been studying this issue of science collaboration? That is, who has been trying to understand the ways in which scientists operate and produce new knowledge, which is essentially the purpose of science. And I want to preface this by saying that there's an old tradition called science and technology studies. It's related to history and philosophy of science, it's sociology of science, but these are people who have been examining the scientific process using particular methodological lenses to try and understand things like the social dimensions of science. One of the quotes is, "It's created, evaluated, challenged, spread, transformed, and fitted into social relations." So they try to understand how people use and debate science and technology. They try to understand the normative issues associated with science and technology, and they try to look at what is the role of science and technology in society. So as I said, this is a field that has been around for a very long time. It's a rich and deep literature. But what's been happening is over the past decade or so, there's been a tremendous increase in research in collaborative interdisciplinary science. So there's been a much bigger investment in research that cuts across disciplines. So this has created kind of tension, a need for the ability to understand these kinds of scientific collaborations. That is, how do scientists work together most effectively? Because they're being brought together, and here's a quote by one of your advisory board members, Dan Stokels, who's been at the forefront of this field. He noted that the inherent complexity of contemporary public health, environmental, political, and policy challenges leads to the realization that an integration of multiple disciplinary perspectives is required to better understand and ameliorate these problems. So going back to the first quote from Salzinger, that is, you need an interdisciplinary team to solve the kinds of complex problems facing the planet today. It's not going to be solved by just biologists. It's not going to be solved just by medical researchers or just by psychologists or just by economists. You need a multifaceted approach, and this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration and the need to understand how to improve this interdisciplinary collaboration has created what I'm about to talk about, this notion of the science of team science. So what's been happening down the street here in Washington is the policy community has said, since we're funding this kind of research, since we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars in collaborative science, we need to make sure that we're advising these people appropriately and measuring their productivity and measuring their outcomes appropriately. And thus was born the science of team science. So in the early 2000s, a number of researchers started to get together, and the National Cancer Institute, I think, was kind of at the forefront of this. And I think it was largely due to their tobacco research centers, which were these very interdisciplinary research centers. And to their credit, they realized that we need to figure out if we really are producing effective outcomes. So this workshop, this conference was held assessing the value of transdisciplinary research. So what they wanted to accomplish here is to look at the state-of-the-art knowledge with regard to transdisciplinary science and training. They wanted to figure out if they had a good handle on the methods and metrics associated with transdisciplinary science. And more importantly, they wanted to think about the priorities for transdisciplinary research. That is, they wanted to be more planful about how do you do transdisciplinary research effectively. And this led to a special issue of the American Journal of Preventive Medicine on the science of team science. So I think this kind of codified several years of their research and thinking about what this phenomena called the science of team science. So Dan Stokels was the lead editor, but Kara Hall, Brandy Taylor, Richard Moser, and Leonard Syme, who are with the National Cancer Institute, all participated in this special issue. So if you haven't read it yet, you should put it on your reading list because they outlined a number of important issues associated with scientific collaboration and what are the issues around scientific collaboration. But around this time, where I had been thinking about it, coming at it from a different angle, was we know a lot about teamwork in different disciplines. So we know about teamwork in the military, we know about teamwork in organizations, we know about teamwork in aviation, but we don't know a lot about teamwork in science. And kind of independently from this group, I had been paying attention to what they had been doing, but it had been primarily through things like workshops and conferences. Not a lot had been published yet. I produced this paper, Interdisciplinary as Teamwork, How the Science of Teams Can Inform Team Science. So it's a subtle play on words there. So what I mean by the science of teams is people in psychology, people in organizational behavior, they had been studying teams in a number of different domains. But we hadn't really studied science teams, that is scientific collaboration, to a great extent. So what I wanted to argue in this paper is we know a lot about collaboration in general. What of that can we think about as applying to helping understand scientific collaboration? So this was my own little thought piece saying, well, this is what we know about teams and how can we apply that to the science of teams and understanding scientific collaborations. So I'm going to, continuing with the timeline, it was also around this time that the cyber infrastructure, the network, social network theory folks had also been making a big influence on the science of team science. And I put this up here because it was published in Nature, and I don't know if you agree with me, probably one of the most influential science journals in the world. And I thought that that was pretty telling that this article was written in the journal Nature. So what they did was they talked about the kind of cyber infrastructure, social network analysis work that had been done, studying scientific collaboration and the influence that it was actually having on the production of knowledge. So what they talked about to a large degree was a paper that came out in the journal Science in 2007. Stefan Wuchte and Brian Utzi and Jones were the authors of this paper, and it was about the increasing influence of collaboration on the production of knowledge. So what they did in that article was they analyzed 20 million journal publications, patents, etc., over 50 years, and they showed the increasing dominance of collaborative papers and collaborative patents on the production of knowledge. So they did this bibliometric, this kind of information technology analysis, and showed the increasing influence of collaboration on scientific production. And this, I say, is kind of a watershed moment for the science of team science. And I say that because what the policy community had now was data that showed here's the relevance of funding scientific collaboration. Look at the impact it's having on the production of knowledge. So with the idea being that we need to invest more money in scientific collaborations because it's having a much bigger impact on different scientific fields. So it wasn't just in a single discipline, it was across a multiple sets of disciplines, from the sciences to the humanities, the increasing dominance of teams in the production of knowledge. And again, this was written up in the journal Nature as recognition of the importance of this finding. So as part of this development, my colleagues and I, we got together. We had some funding from the National Science Foundation where we said, okay, we know that teams are becoming increasingly dominant in science, but we need to do a better job taking what we know about teams and thinking about them in the context of scientific collaboration. I received some funding from the National Science Foundation to host a workshop where I would bring in my colleagues in the organizational and social sciences and say, here's a new area that we haven't studied, that is science collaboration. What are the questions we need to ask in order to determine what we need to understand about science collaboration? Then how can we translate those findings and that science into application to improve the process of scientific collaboration? Also around that time, the National Cancer Institute had been funding their clinical and translational science centers, and they had money to do a similar thing. And thus was born the Science of Team Science Conference. We had our first one back in 2010. It was hosted by Northwestern University. We just had our third one in April. We're having them every year. We've had them every year. And the purpose is similar, where we bring in researchers from different disciplines and all talk about the process of scientific collaboration. So it's not only people like me and people like Dan Stokels, but we also bring in center directors, people who are actually practicing scientific collaboration, because what we're still trying to do is map out the problem space, so to speak, with regard to this challenge of science collaboration. So the whole purpose of the science of team science is to map out this problem space, that is to try and figure out what we don't know, what we do know, and what kind of science we still need to do to improve our understanding and improve the application of teamwork theory to science collaborations. An outcome of this collaboration would be a number of papers that we've published over the past couple of years about the science of team science. So one of our first papers published in the journal Clinical Translational Science was Advancing the Science of Team Science, where we kind of talk about the micro issues, the meso issues, and the macro issues associated with understanding scientific collaboration. Another paper we published in the journal Research Evaluation was trying to map out this problem space to which I referred earlier, where we said, what are the major categories of issues associated with scientific collaboration? So categories such as the group dynamics, what happens when you throw people in a room from different disciplines and how do they produce knowledge, to these more macro level issues, how do science administrators, how do universities encourage and cultivate collaboration across departments? So this was based upon a survey we did of several hundred people who are practicing scientific teamwork as well as researchers who study teams. And based upon that survey, we put out this map of what are the big areas and what are the big questions associated with the science of team science. More recently, the National Science Foundation put out one of their letters, and this was picked up by the Chronicle of Education, that essentially said, we want to see more interdisciplinary collaboration, where they articulated that we know from our own analysis of scientific productivity that the big discoveries, the more impactful discoveries, are happening when people from different disciplines get together. So the president of NSF, the director, said, we want you to collaborate. If you produce proposals that are from people in different departments, it's more likely to be funded, because that's the kind of research. Now, leaving aside the quality issue, all other things equal, if you have quality proposals, we're more interested in the ones that are interdisciplinary in nature. And here's the huge issue, though. The problem is the university, the academic system, hasn't caught up yet entirely with the need for interdisciplinary and collaborative science. And this was one thing that they identified with this call by NSF for saying we want to see more interdisciplinary collaborative proposals. The problem is the tenure system is still working against collaboration and interdisciplinary research. How they're working against that is, if you look at the tenure process and if you look at the criteria for earning tenure, a lot of faculty are discouraged to work with people outside their discipline. So it may be as rigid as you can only publish in these journals. You can't publish in journals outside your discipline. So they're disincentivizing collaborative science. And again, this is a huge problem. And this is a huge barrier, because when the policy community says this is important and when the academic community says, no, we're not going to encourage it, you have this huge disconnect. So I refer to this as the harder problem of the science of team science. How do you change that culture? The hard problem is how do you get people to collaborate in general, and how do you get different disciplines to talk to each other? The harder problem is how do you change institutions to encourage that? And I think when NSF and NIH start saying, we're going to fund that, that's when the administrators are going to say, okay, well, we need to fix this problem at the more local level. And most recently, the National Academy of Science has just received funding to put together a consensus study on the science of team science. So the National Research Council and their board on behavioral, cognitive, and sensory sciences is going to assemble a team of researchers who study scientific collaboration and who study teamwork and understand teamwork in organizations. They're going to bring together experts across all these different fields that I've been talking about, and they're going to basically try to map out a research agenda for the science of team science. So they want to understand, what do we know about scientific collaboration? What don't we know about scientific collaboration? And then how can we fund research to improve scientific collaboration? And this was funded by Susan Winter at the Office of Cyber Infrastructure at the National Science Foundation. And it went to Barb Weinshausen at, as I said, the National Academy of Science. And this was just announced in September. And they're going to be kicking this off over the next couple of years. And the outcome, if you're not familiar with the way the National Research Council operates is they publish these either reports, and sometimes they get produced into these edited volumes that summarize these consensus studies, and then those consensus studies will eventually translate into policy. So hopefully in a few years you'll see a lot of research in support of studying the scientific process when it comes to collaborative interdisciplinary research. So I've talked a lot about interdisciplinary research, and I think it's important to kind of contextualize that with what we mean by interdisciplinary research. And speaking of National Academy's reports, back in 2004, they had the prescience to say, well, we talk a lot about interdisciplinary research, but what do we really mean by that? So they had a workshop called Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research, and the outcome of that workshop was kind of a set of definitions associated with unidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, and interdisciplinary research. So they noted that cross-disciplinary research simply involves investigators from different disciplines, but it doesn't qualify the nature of the interaction between the investigators. Then multidisciplinary research is a more coordinated interaction where they bring people together from different disciplines, but the research is more complementary as opposed to integrative. So in service of objectives, they adopt but don't necessarily integrate the methods of each other. And that's important because when it comes to interdisciplinary research, the goal is this idea of integration. So the integration of ideas, it depends on the degree to which these researchers can come together and produce something that didn't exist before. So interdisciplinary demands more than just complementarity, and the specific definition from Facilitating Interdisciplinary Research is interdisciplinary research consists of something that integrates information, data, techniques, tools, perspectives, concepts, and theories from two or more disciplines or bodies of specialized knowledge. So your center here is essentially trying to accomplish that. You're trying to bring together a bunch of different disciplines and produce something that did not exist before. So the goal is to advance fundamental understanding or to solve problems whose solutions are beyond the scope of a single discipline or field of research practice. So you can cut and paste this and put it right on your website, because that's basically what you're trying to accomplish with this center. And again, this is what the National Academies has articulated as the definition, and this is the one that I rely on whenever I talk about this kind of research. But in the 2008 paper to which I referred to earlier, I said that interdisciplinary research is inherently a team activity, that it's a process engaged by members of a coordinated scientific team. And the reason this is important is just like in fields outside of science, we have seen teamwork emerge for the very same reason. So teams have been brought together in disciplines outside of science for decades now, and the purpose there is to achieve something that a single individual could not achieve, and do so while only maintaining complementary knowledge. So those of you who reflect upon the processes in which you engage as interdisciplinary researchers, you don't hold perfectly overlapping knowledge with people from other disciplines. You need to hold just enough knowledge so that you can collaborate, but you're not going to get a second PhD in a discipline that varies from your own. You want to be able to collaborate these people, so you need to understand enough of what they do in order to produce an integrated scientific outcome. And this is precisely what teamwork researchers has been doing for decades, trying to bring people together from different disciplines in organizations primarily and help them achieve a goal that they couldn't achieve if they had worked independently. So in product development, product design, you have to bring people together from engineering, people from finance, people from marketing. These all have different perspectives on how to produce new ideas and new products, and they have to work together and produce something that an organization can actually utilize. And the analogy here is in science, you're trying to do something similar. You're trying to bring people together from different disciplines and produce something that they couldn't have produced on their own. And the point we've been trying to make with the science of team science is we need to understand this process so that we can improve this process. The only way we can understand this process is if we bring together researchers from different disciplines who study teams and say, okay, take your analytical lenses, whether it be a micro-level analysis where you do kind of an ethnomethodological approach to understand teams, or a macro-level analysis where you do a bibliometric analysis of co-citation indices in different scientific centers. But we need to come together and try to figure out what is the most effective process that leads to the most effective outcomes, and does it vary by different kinds of scientific problems or what have you, because we really want to understand the phenomenon. We really want to be able to improve that phenomena.